Let me share my screen. I put up the slides we're using today in Moodle. Now, today I wanted us to look at how to formulate a research problem and then research questions on the qualitative side. It was going to be a bit much to do the quantitative side as well. I'm going to do a pre-recorded lecture for that and upload it on formulation of quantitative research question and hypothesis. But let us start with this topic on research problems. So essentially, this is the starting point of any research. Before even we do a research design, before you can know what type of research design you're going to do, are you going to do quantitative or qualitative? You need to have first understood your research problem. The research problem is the one which lets us know what type of research, what type of research design we shall have. So a research problem essentially refers to some difficulty which the researcher experiences or observes in a certain context, a certain difficulty. And remember, when we're talking about the difficulty, we're saying we're looking at it in the eyes of a researcher, not as individuals. A research problem is not the kind that we experience as an individual. For example, what do I mean by that? I may have a problem with malaria, and I want to cure it, but that's not a research problem. The how to cure malaria is well known. I may have maybe running a company personally, and I'm experiencing inefficiency in business processes. That's my personal problem, maybe as a company owner, but it's not a research problem. So we must be viewing this in the eyes of a researcher. Why? Then what kind of problem is that? That problem would then exist within a context which is either theoretical or a practical situation. Now, when we say theoretical, we know that is from literature. And when we say practical, you might say, well, all the other examples you've given are practical. No, not necessarily in that sense. A practical problem in the sense that it exists in a certain sector, in a certain practical context. Take an example. An IS researcher may observe that adoption of certain technologies is much harder, is much more challenging than others. And the researcher may then want to go and discover why. Or there may be some proposed methodology of implementation and adoption of a technology, and an IS researcher would say, I want to test this, if this theory or this proposal works, and they try it and they see if it works. Or there may be a proposal within the IS field that this method of designing a system guarantees greater chances of adoption, greater chances of usability than any other method. So an IS researcher will say, okay, let me try it and evaluate if this is true or not. So this is the practical situations that we are talking about here. So in that sense, when the person views that difficulty, they then intend to look for a solution for the same. Yeah. So then that the research then motivates that complexity, that difficulty, motivates the researcher into looking for a solution for that challenge. So as I stated earlier, the research problem is the first step that we carry out in research. Then the research problem, like we said, in the practical sense, it can be a result from a real life situation, or it may refer to a set of opportunities. for the IS example where I said there may be a proposal from another research, they've come up with a new method of designing more useful artifact, a more usable artifact. And they say, then we say, okay, we've probably experienced quite a number of challenges with systems that have been developed. Let me try this and then see if adoption, if perception of usability is greater after the whole exercise has been done. Something like that. For ICT students, you may see it even in another way. There are so many propositions. For example, would introducing an ICT strategy improve ICT processes? Would that bring an improvement? A person can decide, let me try that out and see in a an organization which is within Uganda's context, a typical one, and see, does it bring about improved governance, and improved governance therefore improves ICT processes? Is that right? If I implement an enterprise architecture, does it truly bring about improved ICT governance processes? And they may even actually unearth certain things that may exist in a Ugandan context that may not exist elsewhere, maybe in a European context, things that may affect the processes, or rather the effects of an enterprise architecture. So all those are possible areas of research. So types of research questions. We have two types of research, so not questions, sorry, two types of research problems. There are those which states, which relate to the nature of things. Some of them I have already given, but here I give you one of them. So here we're talking about research problem, not a research question, a research problem. So here you see an example, the state of ICT governance processes in institutions of higher learning. Then there are others which are basically talking about relationships between variables. Now, from our discussions so far we've had, especially with research design, you can already tell which one leans towards qualitative, which one leans towards quantitative. Whenever we have a research problem which is talking about variables, variables, that research is leaning towards quantitative research. Whenever we have a research problem that is referring to the state of something, we want to understand the state of something, we want to explore it, to understand it, to describe it, the state of something, that one is leaning towards qualitative research. So far, are we making sense?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what are the components of a research problem? One is, to begin with, is where we identify it. The research problem may exist with an individual. Okay, it may exist with an individual. You remember I told you about a research which was done by a researcher in Tanzania, where she specifically focused on one couple. And of course, particularly with the wife, because it was a gender-based study and specifically focused on the woman. So that was with an individual, and that is possible. That kind of research is qualitative research. It can exist in a group. Now, this group of people could be a section in the population. We can say students of secondary school age, and specifically rural schools. That is a group. It could even be smaller, it can be bigger, depending. The size also then determines whether it's your research is qualitative or quantitative. It can exist in an organization. That this is where you have a case study. An organization which has a specific, or you can see it in specific organizations in a specific sector. Okay, this is where you have multiple case study strategy, where you have several organizations For example, this may be this may be in the education sector and specifically institutions of higher learning. This could be in this multimedia, what do they call them? These all the multinational companies like MTN, UTL belongs specifically, but MTN, UTL, that kind of thing, where you may view them in that aspect. Philip, do you have a question? Phillips, do you have a question? No? Okay, let me just mute. Now, once that problem has been identified, then an objective is obtained. An objective, which this may be stated in form of a research question, in form of a hypothesis, or it's actually stated as an objective, but something is then stated like, this is what, as a researcher, I want to do in regard to this specific problem. Then we also always indicate alternative means for obtaining the objective. This is where literature review comes in, because the one thing you want to do as a researcher is to ensure you let the reader know that this issue may have been solved before, my objective of doing it this way I'm not saying that it's the only way. There are other ways, but I choose to use this format of looking at things. I remember for myself when I was defending my thesis, there was a professor on the panel as I was defending my work. He had also done more or less similar research work in Ghana. And for them, they had taken a different perspective. So he kept saying, for us, we did this. So one thing somebody had told me is that don't allow anyone to derail you from the way you've chosen it. Yes, even in your writing, you acknowledge there that these researchers did this, these researchers did this, but I'm choosing this format because this is what I see maybe is lacking. Phillips, you're raising your hand?
No, sorry.
Okay. So this is why we we state the alternative means of attaining the objective. So for myself in the defense, what I did was inform the professor that yes, I am aware that you've taken that path, but specifically for my research, I chose this path and I stated the reasons why I chose that path. And at a certain point when he was insisting, the chair of the panel shut him down and said, no, if you're satisfied with the answer, then don't continue. So it's also because you don't have to follow what others are doing. If you're choosing another way of tackling the issue, there is no problem about doing that. Take an example, someone may say in IS that all systems that have been developed have been done so from using a top-down approach. I want to use a bottom-up. For example, many people use the design science approach. I want to use it using an action design science approach coming from the bottom-up. That one is okay. And somebody argues that the reasons for it, and there's no problem with that. So as you're pointing out the alternative means, of course you will question yourself about why you've chosen a certain path. But again, as long as you have some valid reasons, there is nothing wrong with it. Then the research itself, you need to talk about the environment in which the difficulty exists. So sometimes researchers tend to focus on the problem and forget the environment in which the problem exists. You need to contextualize it, or in other words, what people say is you need to understand the nature of the problem and also communicate this to the reader. Understand the nature and communicate it in your writing. So this requires, of course, extensive literature review on the part of the researcher. In selecting a research problem, what should we avoid? Sorry, I get an allergic cough every time I come into this room. So one is we should avoid topics which have been overdone. Yeah, that's why literature review is extremely important. Avoid topics or subjects which have been overdone. You won't bring any novelty to your research, and sometimes we just want to do the dissertation just for the sake of getting that degree. But there's one thing I would encourage for each one of you, that sense of integrity, that I've done something and I've done it to the best of my ability. So look for an area that really is seeking for new knowledge. This knowledge may be in terms of an area that has not been, obviously it's always an area that has not been done. We in Africa, in Uganda, we have the advantage that our context is quite new. There's a lot of publications which have not been done to see how certain things react. There are proposals from the West. Look at the area of ICT governance. It's relatively new, or ICT architecture and design. It's a relatively new area in Uganda. So really to understand, let's say the way enterprise architecture would react in a Ugandan context, it's something to think about. Areas of security and so on and so forth, they're all quite brand new. We have an emerging sector in software development. We have certain people should I say, entities that have cropped up in the ecosystem, people who are developing systems for the Ugandan context. What methodology are they using? Why is it we are not seeing a widespread adoption of IS developed within Uganda? Almost all softwares are developed from the West, from China, from India, and so on and so forth. But nothing is ever done. What is it that is lacking in our context? What, in terms of design elements and things like that, what are those things that, if I develop a system from the bottom up in Uganda, what would that effect? What effect would we have in something like that? Those are questions that really we can try to find out within our context. What is unique that may not exist elsewhere? Our business processes definitely differ from those in the Western world. They definitely differ. There are similarities, but there are also differences. How would those unique business processes, or the way we do things, how would they affect the development, the design and development of an IS system within Uganda? Those are questions we can tackle as IS and ICT students. When you're selecting a research problem, avoid controversial subjects. Avoid controversial subjects. Now, you may wonder in ICT, what area is controversial here? Well, we normally, IS is always seen as subjective, or ICT is seen as subjective, but there are certain things that may really be controversial within an organization. I'll give you an example. Zivasite in Umu is highly, highly controversial. There are those who are totally for it, and there are those who are completely against it. So if one was decided to do research on that, this would be a highly controversial subject, and probably the data you'd pick may be highly controversial as well. So that you can imagine there are some subjects, something as simple as a system it becomes quite controversial within a certain context. Now, the other thing is to look at your research area. And here you must have a really good discussion with your supervisor. Your problem may be too narrow or too vague. Yeah, too narrow or too vague. If it's too narrow, then you'll hardly pick any data out of it. You'll hardly pick anything that is worth reporting. If it's too vague, it is unsolvable. Okay? So there's a fine balance between the two, and you really need to work hand in hand with your supervisor to narrow down on a specific area. Literature review is extremely important because literature review guides you on what areas are actually in need of research. Select an area which you're familiar with as an individual and feasible. One of the things that is key is that you must have an interest in the area you want to research. Then feasible, meaning that this is something that you can easily access data, you can easily access the respondents, and so on and so forth. You think some things you may need to consider the cost that may be involved, the time factor, your qualifications, how, now for example, Crippen is extremely good with quantitative research. If you may not be, this may be a daunting area for you, may say, no, I think I may avoid quantitative research. So look at areas where you know you have strengths. If somebody says, one person says, I want to do my research by developing an application, and the person is actually good at it, really good at that side of things, then go for that. Although one of the things I think we may need to have is a discussion, maybe with the faculty, to see what is feasible, because there are some people who I don't know what, I have not been in the faculty for quite some time. I only came back to teach this year. I don't know what the rules are. This is one of the things that we need to discuss when we have a research workshop. Selection of a problem must be preceded by a preliminary study in case of new problems. So, in other words, the preliminary study is literature review and state-of-the-art literature review. What we mean by state-of-the-art, you must read up-to-date information about your subject area, okay? So that you don't try to tackle something that has already been tackled and published about. Let me first move this down here. Some techniques involved in defining a research problem. First, the statement of the problem, okay? So the statement of the problem, we would have, before even we state the problem, would have had a discussion in your background. So in the background of the study, you essentially discuss the problem at length. You essentially discuss it at length, defending or rather arguing for its presence and pinpointing in literature where they actually indicate the problem exists, okay? The literature must point out that the problem exists here. This must be clear, so that by the time you come to your statement of the problem section, you're making a general statement about it. You're basically giving a paragraph or two stating the problem. So in the background, you'd have discussed it extensively, and your reader would automatically see the problem from your writing in the background. So by the time you come to this the section of problem statement, you're giving just a general statement or a general definition of your problem statement. In the background, you'd have given a clear description of the nature of the problem. So you must have an understanding of the nature of the problem. What do I mean? Let us say we are discussing, we want to talk about let's talk about governance, ICT governance. And specifically, we want to talk about the need for an ICT strategy and policy. In our background discussion and later on in our literature review, we must have an understanding of what ICT governance is in general. We must understand what strategy and policy is. What contribution do they make? Moses has raising a hand. Yes, Moses?
Yes, Doctor. I just some small clarification.
Yes, please.
You said we shouldn't, like as a researcher, I shouldn't look out for some of the topics which have already been raised before, like published before.
Yeah, those which have especially been overdone.
Yes. Now my question is there any research repository online which at least where we can check and see, like if I have a certain kind of a topic I want to research on, is there any repository apart from searching on Google or internet for
yes.
research?
Google, you mean Google Scholar?
Yes, like
Google Scholar.
I know of something like a ResearchGate, but is there any other repository where I can keep referring if I get some idea, I keep referring for published work?
Well, it depends on your research area. There is there's research in healthcare. There's research in health informatics, and each of them will have different journal positions. But however, Google Scholar is a good place to start because Google Scholar, I think, tries to get into most of these journals and get to you any place, any published article regarding your subject area, the subject area you want. As for which particular journal, one, I would start with the things we have. Start with Google Scholar, that is one. Two, start with the UMU e-resources because the library tries to get all possible journals which cover different areas. Some are in agriculture, others are in healthcare, others are in business, whatever it is. There are several of them. If you're looking for even more information, you can contact the library. What we can do when we have the workshop, the research workshop, we will try to get from everybody who will be present, all the other doctors and other researchers, what areas you can look at. What repository sorry you can search from. But one of the key things I wanted to point out is we don't want to say don't do research which has been done. No, don't do research which has been overdone. I gave you the example. I think I've given an example of a master's student in ICT that I supervised. There was a research done in South Africa on a community health informatics, mHealth application. And this research came up with a framework on how to implement and sustain this community mHealth application. So what he did was, because it was done in a specific context, those results become a bit difficult because it's done within a context. Those researchers couldn't generalize in quotes to other areas because what exists in South Africa, you may not find it in Uganda, in the context of Uganda. So what he did was to get their framework that they had developed. His research was then to try to validate their findings. that are the variables they have identified in South Africa, do they also exist in Uganda? So what he did was replicate their research. I don't know, Moses, if you've understood what I'm saying. It isn't that we're saying don't do other research. Yeah. Yes, Moses?
Yes, Doctor.
Yeah.
Yes, I've gotten it well.
Okay. Actually, Moses, you preempt what I was saying. The other thing, the thing that we need to be able to answer your query is surveying the available literature. So of course, one of the key points is trying to find that literature. This is one of the most laborious processes of research, surveying available literature, because it is widespread, it's boring, it's really boring. Nobody likes reading academic articles. Nobody likes it, but it's a necessary evil. There are some things you can skim through. I mean, just by reading the abstract, a little bit of the introduction, you can tell whether this research, where this article may be necessary for your work. You can try to read through quite a bit. So you'll do quite a lot of downloads. But yeah, but just learn how to skim through discard any article that may be a waste of your time. Also discuss with your supervisor. You'll be quite lucky if you get a supervisor who is doing research who is interested in the area of your research. That would be a lucky point, because a seasoned researcher can guide you quite well. I remember my supervisor was extremely helpful when at certain points, as I would write chapter after chapter, they were disorganized till he sat me down and said, no, write a chapter structure. And after that, my chapters became much better organized and more understood. I remember with methodology, I was completely green. And then he gives me an article on action design research. And it really made sense. That's the method I was using, and I didn't even know. So getting a good supervisor really helps. Discuss your problem. Discuss your problem with your supervisor. If you have colleagues you're with, sit down and discuss. The more you discuss it, the more the logic opens up to you. One of the things I learned, one of the things I picked from doing my PhD was, this thing was first told me by another person who had gotten a PhD. It was a nun at UMO. She told me that when you're doing a PhD, the most important thing is not the information you've discovered. Most of the time, you'll even forget what research you did, but you learn something about yourself. One of the things I realized when I was doing the PhD is that how much I respond to logic. And the first time when you're starting, everything is quite heavy. You can't make sense of what it is you want to do. But the minute you do make sense of it, it becomes even easier for you to write. Why? Because once you see the logic yourself, you can then communicate it clearly to your readers, to your supervisor, to the one marking, and so on and so forth. This logic, you must see it. So that is why discussing your ideas, developing them, is extremely important, so that you understand clearly the problem, what you want to do, and how you're going to do it. That is a key point in research. Once you've understood this point, then you can rephrase your research problem into a working proposition. This working proposition may be in terms of a hypothesis, in terms of a research question. If it is qualitative research, it becomes a research question which you go about answering. If it's a hypothesis, then you're basically saying, I am going to prove or disprove to see if this variable actually affects this variable, or to see if I introduce this variable, it will actually create a positive or negative effect on the dependent variable. Things like that, something like that. So how would we start formulating that research problem? What steps would we take? The first thing is identify a broad area, any broad area, like what some of the examples I was giving. Someone may say, I'm interested in ICT governance. Another person may say, I'm interested in cybersecurity. Another person will say, I'm interested in interoperability. Another person will say ICT and human-computer interactions, because human-computer interaction is another topic on its own. Underneath that, someone may say, maybe under human-computer interaction, one may say, I want to look at a context-aware applications or systems. That's another area. And maybe someone wants to look at a context-aware system within the context of Uganda's available technology. What can they do? What can they not do? So in that sense, you're dissecting your broad area into sub-areas. Yeah. So for instance, for cybersecurity, one may say, I'm going to look at network security or web security, database security. And then the person then begins to pinpoint problem areas, research problem areas under those topics. Am I making any sense so far?
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes.
Okay, so for IS, yes, so for IS researchers, you see, there is quite a lot you can do in your research, quite a lot. Same thing for ICT, there's really quite a lot that we can do. Then mark up your interest. That means really pick a subject, the subject area you want. You won't be able to study everything, but you can select an area that is of interest to you. Now, just as you selected your broad area, you then study the research question, the area of interest to you. You study a research question based, of course, on the literature. You begin to formulate your research question or hypothesis. So after you've decided on your research question, you set your objectives. Now, I just want to make something clear here. As we discuss this, everything may, and especially when we go to research questions on the qualitative side, we may, I just want to state this. Most of you may have received the faculty handout book, yeah?
Not me.
So some may not have. Maybe we need to tell the faculty administrator if she can give you a soft copy. The faculty handbook states the format that is expected, format of your dissertation that is expected. So I'm not sure for masters, but I think there's something like you have a general objective and then sub-objectives. You can do that, but for the sake of UMU, because that's the format they expect. But one of the things I want to state, if you're doing qualitative research, you generally should have an overall research question, which is then split into sub-questions. Now, because of UMU's format, you can translate that into a main objective, which is then split into sub-objectives, something like that, just to follow UMU's format. But we can have a discussion with the faculty when we have the research workshop and see what is possible, what is not possible. But anyway, back to our discussion. After you have selected your research question, you then clearly state what your objective is. So the objective can be in terms of a research question, it can be in terms of, but even if it's quantitative research, you will have a research question. A research question, then or an objective. Yeah, so either one of them. But your research question is essentially your objective because it's the question you intend to answer. Now, overall, you must have one main objective or research question, then you develop sub-objectives. Now, the sub-objectives, once you fulfill each sub-objective, it should answer the overall main objective. Yeah, once you have the overall main objective or main research question, the sub-objectives or sub-research questions should help you answer the overall. Now, I'll just give the most elementary one, which most of you may have done at undergraduate level since you're IS or since you're from an IT background. Most of you must have. This is the most basic level. I'm not proposing this for masters. For most of you, when you did your project at undergraduate level, you must have had an overall objective of saying the objective is to design and implement maybe an e-learning system or a student information system or a website for a school or something like that. That would have been the main objective. The sub-objective would have started by saying, the first one would have said by saying, determine the business processes or study, something like define or describe the business processes. For the student information system, this would be under registry. The business processes in registry that support, that I need or collect student information, collect and manipulate student information. The second one would be design and the student information system based on the processes in objective 1. 3 would be test and implement the system. Now you see those 3 sub-objectives are answering the overall of design and implementation. That once you fulfill the 3 of them, you basically you're basically answering the overall objective. Now it's the same logic you'd have if you have an overall objective, or then which overall objective is then split into sub-objectives or hypotheses. So once you have you've answered each of those, you then answer your overall objective or research question. So far, am I making sense?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, with your objectives, assess if they are attainable. Assess if they're attainable. And this you'd go through it with your supervisor, and you can also discuss with your colleagues. Assess if your objectives are attainable. One, in terms of budget and time. You can look at the resources you have available to you. Also consider reality. Is this something that is attainable? If I'm saying that I'm going to develop a fully fledged e-learning system, fully fledged in a space of a year, that is not possible. If you look at Moodle, Moodle is one of the most mature e-learning systems. It has been developed over a space of years and years, and it's still under development. So there is no way you can say that is realistic. In that sense, it's not realistic. Ask yourself, what would be the outcome? What will the outcome be? What do I want at the end of this? What do I want to consider? And is it attainable within the time frame that I have? Those are key questions. So those are things that you need to ask to ask really with your supervisor. It takes some time. Usually I tell like I was telling my undergraduate students on Thursday, please start now. When I gave them their first assignment, I asked them to give me scope of time, and every group was telling me this research will be done in 2 weeks. And I told them, no, that is not possible. I asked each of them that your first assignment of identification of a research problem, how many of you got it right? And these were about 12 groups. All of them said, no, none. So I said, this was done in groups. You individually, you're going to start identifying and formulating your own problem. Do you know how many times you'll go back and forth with your supervisor? So normally I tell people, start as soon as possible. Start reading now, exploring literature about an area that you have interest in, an area that you have observed at your workplace, in general, your different work experience. Just go back and read and check through. The last point would be check back. That means review your steps. Just keep going back and reviewing. the issue of problem formulation or formulating your research problem, it's an iterative process. By the time you refine it, it takes quite a bit of time. Some people are lucky, they get it early enough, but others no. So the earlier you start, the better, and reevaluating yourself throughout the process is key. So in this particular lecture, I wanted us to see, since we've looked at formulation of research problems, which then leads to a research question, I wanted us to look at qualitative research questions. So first of all, let us understand one thing. When we have a research question in qualitative research, we are not assuming anything, which is something we shall see a great deal in quantitative research. In quantitative research, there's always an assumption. This will lead to this. This will affect this, either positively or negatively, something like that. There are no assumptions with qualitative research. With qualitative research, we are exploring. We are seeking to understand. We are trying to describe something that, so it's not an assumption. So with qualitative research, we always have a central or main question, which is broad, yeah, which is seeking to explore a phenomenon. So it's the main question. Relatively what we've been saying earlier, whether it's called an objective or a general research question, you have one major question which seeks to explore a phenomenon. Yeah. The researcher needs to ask himself or herself, what is the broadest question that I can ask in the study? Broadest. This is trying to help us not to be too narrow with our research, not to be too narrow, but then again, not to be vague. We must be answering a specific question with giving a specific answer. So qualitative research usually, the qualitative research question usually begins with what, how, or in what ways. So usually when a question begins why, that is normally on the quantitative side, because why implies there's a cause and effect. That implies an assumption. So usually qualitative questions don't begin with why. Okay? Why does this affect this? We don't know. In qualitative research, we essentially don't know. So you usually have questions which say what, how, in what ways. Identify the central phenomenon you want to explore. So in the research question, you're telling us what it is you want to explore. The research question must be stating that. The question, in your question, you're going to describe, explore, generate, discover, understand. So essentially, your research question may be bringing out any of these to generate, that is to describe, or to identify, or determine, discover, something like that. Avoid, again, we repeat, avoid the quantitative words such as influence, affect, cause. We may want to find out what affects. What affects? That question is valid. What affects this? Maybe what would affect enterprise architecture in a Ugandan organization? What would affect its because enterprise architecture is proposing something. What would affect if the enterprise architecture from producing the desired result? We would ask that question because we don't know. That question is valid. So here I give an example. What factors would affect the adoption of an IS innovation in an organization? So that would be a question for maybe an IS researcher, specific adoption of a certain application. Someone may also want to discover what may affect the adoption of mobile applications in Uganda. Is it possible to develop a mobile application that's used? What are those factors that would affect? That's an exploratory study, a descriptive study. I've also given some more. How would adoption of enterprise architecture affect ICT business processes? Those are all possible qualitative research questions that we may have. Now, as we stated earlier, like either it's quantitative research or qualitative. In qualitative research, your central question is then split into sub-questions. So the sub-questions would narrow down the focus. And each of the sub-questions would help, let me move this up. Each of the sub-questions would help answer the central question. So I gave you the most basic example with the undergraduate studies, but we can also have a discussion with the assignment that I'm giving you next, to see how we can possibly do that. So essentially, the sub-questions are more specific, and you can also use them as you go out to collect your data. Because as you collect your data, your sub-questions, you would let's say organize your interview schedule or your observation checklist, or whether interviews with individuals or focus group discussion, whatever it is, you'd arrange them based on your sub-questions, because your intention is to answer the sub-questions or objectives. So you would organize them, you'd arrange your tools based on your sub-questions. As you're defining your overall research question, one of the things about the research questions in qualitative research, they are based on emerging design. In other words, that the method that you're using, the research method that you're using, and the research design that you're using, your research question would essentially would essentially hint at it or point to it. When we are going out to discover, we are basically focusing on grounded theory. When we are seeking to understand, normally that is ethnography. Now, bear in mind, even in IS research, we can use ethnography, yeah? I found an article, I don't know if I can find it and give it to you. Even something as simple as IS research or ICT, you can use ethnography. Why? Organizations have a culture. There are different cultures in different organizations. And you can see this. Just to give you an example, if you go to an organization that is managed by Kenyans, there is a certain culture that develops. An organization that maybe has on top management is Indians, automatically there is a culture that is developed. If you have an organization which has a religious foundation, the culture there also is also different. Just a case in point I think of. I've told you already about my relationship with Palliative Care Association of Uganda. The first time I went to visit them, they asked me to come for a meeting in the morning, and I came to the office at 9. Now, what I found immediately, the first thing they do as an organization, at 9 a.m. sharp, all of them convene. They work in a house, so it's a very small entity. So they work in a house. It's their office, but it's a house. The first thing they do, they sit in the general area, which would be the reception area, and they start with the praise and worship songs. Then they are followed by a word of inspiration. I think that the lady who first founded it, she's a lady called Rose Chiwanuka, one of the first palliative care nurse we had in Uganda. I think she's Anglican and deeply religious. So that's the first thing they do. Now already you see that's a culture. Now as a culture, you see that culture will seep through in everything, in everything that is done. If you go to an organization which is female dominated, there's a culture there. And this culture is ultimately going to affect any system that you implement, any ICT governance, or whatever it is, there's going to be an effect. So it's even possible to do ethnographic research in an IT environment. When we want to explore a process, basically that's a case study. To describe, it's a phenomenology. Report stories, that's a narrative research. Maybe in ICT, we may not have something like this. But you notice that these three in the center, ethnography, case study, phenomenology, these are applicable in ICT IS research. Now, note that if you're designing an artifact, you may combine case study together with design science, case study with action design, something like that. It's possible. Common problems we may find with developing a qualitative research questions. Trying to decide which area to look at from a range of
Excuse me, doctor.
Yes, please.
This is Tom Semugoma. There
Yes,
is a question. Thank you so much for really this. You've described this thing very well. But my question is,
Yes.
Is it possible, for example, when you're trying to come up with your problem statement, is it possible to first develop, like, for example, in the process of coming up with your own, okay, you could be having it, but you want to build it from the existing problems that were addressed by various researchers.
Yes.
For example, I don't know how we can phrase that, but is it allowed, like, to develop your problem statement from those problems that were being addressed by, various researchers researching on various, platforms? Take a situation. I'm very interested in customer retention. I'm very sorry to overbring it here on this platform.
It's okay.
Yes, because customer retention, it is the key in most of the, companies. How do we retain customers? So if, like, I'm trying to come up with my concept, I want to design a model. Am I allowed to, like, for example, first relate to these people who researched in line of that customer retention, and then at the end, then I address my problem statement in line with those various researchers? And secondly, how can I even really phrase it and then I switch it in line with those various researchers? For example, I can relate that, let's say, Dr. Also researched on this. How can I really reference their research in line with mine, and then I bring in my problem statement and I give that description to fit into my research?
Okay. Let me just pull up here. I think I can just show you something, at least the first chapter of my research. Hold on a second. Okay. Now, in this specific subtopic, this is where I talk about the gaps. So I point out that there were two gaps in the field of mHealth. The first thing is these writers said there was a lack of evaluation to determine what works and what does not work. Yeah. So this writer specifically pointed it out that there is this gap.
Yes.
And then here again, I point out that these writers say that it is for this reason there has been a call. So these writers, Michael, the Tran and Michael and so on and so forth, they had made a call that there's a need for objective evaluation of mHealth initiatives. So therefore, my research, that was what it was going to embark on. I was going to implement an mHealth initiative, evaluate it, and from that, develop a model.
Okay.
Yeah. Then here I also went ahead and said the second gap is the lack of research method application to the design and deployment. Yeah. So these were gaps that these people were talking about. We were talking about gaps. Now, the other thing also, someone may not necessarily point out a gap. The other thing somebody might say is they've done this research, they've implemented this, but they implemented it in a context different from Uganda. Do you understand?
Yes, doctor.
Yeah.
It is really, it is now coming out clearly.
Yes.
But yes, I think it's okay now. It's clear.
Yes. So you may have a situation when you are looking at, there are people who have pointed out this problem, they've done the research and gotten results, but what if we're looking at the same thing, customer retention, in the context of Uganda? Because contexts differ. Context differ. The way a customer thinks and feels in Uganda is not the same way a customer thinks and feels in Japan or elsewhere. Yeah, the cultures differ, completely differ. I'll just give you an example. There's an example I usually give to my students in education when it comes to communication. There was a situation that happened in Japan where there was a company which took a brand of yogurt to Japan, and they were asked. They first, before they put it on the market, they called a sample group. They gave them the yogurt and asked them to taste. Then at the end, they asked them, "Do you like it?" And all these Japanese bowed down, smiling. So they assumed they were saying yes. They gave them the second sample and third and so on and so forth. And then they went out and put it on the market and nobody bought it. And then later on, they found that in Japan, it was extremely rude to say, "No, I don't like this thing." Yeah. You see, that was a cultural thing. Now, the same thing, what is it in Uganda that helps support customer retention? Do we have the same perspective as far as innovations? Can using an application retain me as a customer? I have an uncle, to this day, he does not use the ATM. He cannot use the ATM going to the bank. In this day and age, now we've even moved beyond ATMs. We're now using mobile phones.
He feels much comfortable to go to the banking hall.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So you see, there are certain things that are they are so unique to a context that that a research needs to be done within that context. Look at the thing of mobile money. This was an innovation that happened in Africa. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's an innovation that is unique to Africa itself, of using mobile money. Yeah. Why? Because we have a huge population that is unbanked. Those are unique things that really are context based.
Yes, please, Tom.
Yes.
Yes, doctor. This is Crippen.
Yes, Crippen.
Now, in all researches, there is a section for a problem statement. Now, this section normally takes 1 page. Some people even require that you write your problem in 1 page, or sometimes even like 3/4 of a page. Now, when you are writing a problem statement, Tom, there are steps you go through.
Yes.
For example, you are saying customer retention. Let me just take like 2 minutes. There is what we call an ideal. There are different approaches to the problem statement, but this is one of them. Now, when you are starting a problem statement, that 1 page, there's what we call an ideal situation. Let me give you an example of customer retention. Why do companies retain customers? They retain because they want to increase their business, they want loyalty, they want different things. Now, in that small first sentences, you can state that customer retention is a cornerstone to business survival, because you have the customers, they will help you in marketing, word of mouth, those core things, those are good things of customer retention.
Yes.
Now, we call it the ideal situation because it is not easy to attain those ideal situations. It is just a small, like it can actually be like 2 or 3 sentences. Now, once you state the ideal situation, you state what has been done to achieve the ideal situation. Number one, we have said we need to retain customers because they increase on our sales. What has the company done to retain those customers? You have introduced the discounts. You have introduced the gifts at the end of the year. You have introduced special packages. These special packages were introduced in order to achieve the ideal situation. And in this case, our ideal situation is customer retention. Now, when you finish that, you go to what is the actual situation. This is where the reports come in.
Actual? You said actual?
The actual situation.
Yes.
In this actual situation, this is where people bring in percentages. People quote other reports. For example, you can say, however, remember, however, with the efforts we have put in, reports indicate that in the last year, only 10% of our former customers came back to us. You quote somebody who said it. You can also quote another person and say who says that customer retention may not be necessary for the survival of the company. That's the ideal situation. Let me give you another example. Tomo, you may decide to start a school in your village.
Yes.
Why do you want to start this school? You could do it because you want to make money, because you want to name the school after your father. You want to educate people in your village so that they can be educated.
Yes.
Now, those things that I'm stating, they are the ideal situation. So what are you going to do? You're going to buy land, you're going to employ teachers, you're going to build, you're going to register with Ministry of Education. That's what has been done to achieve the ideal of a school.
Ideal situations, can they be the objectives of your research?
Now that's a different angle,
Okay.
but we shall also look at it. I just want to show you how they build that problem statement.
Yes.
But after building the school, after registering, at the end of the year, what are the reports saying? The reports indicated that instead of students passing, students failed. The reports indicated that there are a lot of pregnancies within the school. Reports indicated that the teachers were not educating. That's why you bring in the words like, however, words like, despite of the efforts. Are we together, Tom? Now, that is the third step. The next step is the evidence. You need to bring in the evidence. Like, for example, you say, in the last meeting, or according to the IGG report, or according to reports from the UNEB, this and this happened. That's the evidence you bring in. And people normally say, arresting the problem. Because once you don't bring out that, then it will be really hard to know exactly what is the issue. Then another step would be stating the consequences if the problem is not addressed. That's why you find the problems like, if this is not done, there will be catastrophe in this organization. If the customer retention is not really looked after, we are going to lose more customers who have been helping us doing word of mouth marketing. The last step is the intention of your study. That's why like, the intention of this study is to help address this and this and this. So those are the 6 steps you go through to write a problem statement. The ideal situation, what has been done to achieve the ideal situation, what are the reports saying, what is the evidence, what are the consequences, what is the intention of your study. That's how the problem statement is developed.
Thank you so much, Crippen.
Thank you, Crippen. Thank you for that clarification. Thank you so much. So I think we've had quite a good discussion on that. And Crippen has given us a good explanation of how to clearly articulate your research problem and then eventually your research question. Now, for specifically qualitative research, just to go back on some of the things we talked about, your research question should, where can it focus on? Focus on exploring effects. Like we said, you can ask, what is the effect of this on this? It's possible, but you don't say, you're not trying to prove or measure. You don't have a hypothesis there. You don't have a proposition there. You're trying to understand issues. You're trying to gather participants' perception. You're trying to, and your responses are open and flexible. So essentially, the data you're collecting is something that is quite open. Unlike, for example, let's say when you have a questionnaire, and the questionnaire has very controlled answers. It's either yes or no. It's either agree, disagree, or things like that. Very specific, but with the research qualitative side, you expect responses that are flexible, that are seeking to understand the perceptions, the opinions of your participants or those in the context. So how would we ask the right questions in qualitative research? We would ask, how are things being done? That's what we want to know. How are things being done? If you're trying to understand ICT processes, how are they being done? How do people perceive how things are being done? And here, this is where an unbiased approach is extremely important. Or on the side of the researcher, you may get a biased response from the participant. That is okay. If there's, like, for instance, someone can come and say, I don't want to use this system because it doesn't work. Yeah, the person may be biased. Then your job as a researcher is to find out, why do they think it doesn't work? Yeah, the system functionally may work, and the one who developed it may accept it works, but the respondent, maybe this system does not respond to his or her needs, maybe at their work desk. There is something about it that makes his or her perception negative towards that system, or towards a new business process, a new way of doing things. What are those things? So you're trying to understand, how are things being done? How do people perceive? What factors contribute to an outcome? Those are things that you're trying to ask. In what ways do people view a certain issue or problem? How do people feel about something? To what extent are people being affected by this thing? Is it in a positive way or in a negative way? In what ways do people deal with a certain situation? So in qualitative research, you're getting the holistic picture. So you would have the qualitative research questions would fall in these categories. There are those which are descriptive, ask about what actually happens. Those are descriptive. Interpretive is when you want to understand the meaning behind something. This is where you'd have probably some probing questions. What do you mean about this? How do you feel about this? And things like that. Theoretical, ask why those things happen. Why do you think this thing happens? And so on and so forth. You'd ask those questions to your respondents. What would be a good qualitative research questions? One that is specific. Now, this is whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative. but a research question must be specific. That means this is where you're trying to avoid a vague question. One can see what it is you're trying to research. Clearly see this is what this person is trying to discover. It focuses your research, that you as a researcher, you know the direction that you're going. That even your research question, your overall research question and your sub-questions, when you're in the field, you know exactly where they are guiding you on what to discover. It requires an answer. At the end of it, you must give a precise answer. And that answer can be given through research. Yeah. So your research process, your research methodology, and all the tools you adopt should be able to give you the answer you want. It must be important to a field. So it shouldn't be something important to you alone. It should be important to a field. Because at the end of the day, your research is supposed to be reported back. It's supposed to be communicated back, not simply kept in the library and to give you that grade. It should also be manageable. It shouldn't be too broad or too narrow. Avoid a simple and easy answer. For example, if I wanted to understand what variance means, I can Google that and I get the answer. I cannot have that as a research question. What is variance? That can be Googled. If it can be answered in one word or sentence. So this should be an area that you really go out to try and discover, that you interview people, you observe, you read documentation, you have focus group discussions, and so on and so forth. It really requires you to go out and seek. At the end, if you don't have an answer, then that wasn't a research question. It shouldn't be focused, it shouldn't be a matter of opinion. It shouldn't be a matter of opinion. If it's too complicated or too broad or vague. Here are just some examples of problematic research questions. What is the best way to teach ELS oral skills? What is the best way to teach? That is a problematic response. That's already known. What can we do to teach English to students effectively? I think those are things that are already known. So these are problematic. Do Korean English teachers enjoy their job? Does your nationality matter? Where you are, where you come from? It's like asking, do Batoro teachers enjoy teaching English more than Baganda teachers? No, that is not a case. To love to teach in the teaching profession, it depends on an individual. And those questions have already been answered. So here are just some examples of good research questions. So here is one, what are the characteristics of oral English language instruction provided for 10th grade, blah, blah, blah. So here one knows that you're looking for characteristics for teaching oral English language. One can clearly see that. And you know that as you do your research, you can pick, you're actually going to get those characteristics and report them back. What is the impact of explicit writing? In what ways does the Korean English teacher use? So there may be certain things that maybe the Korean teacher has a certain, maybe has a curriculum, there are policies on how they're supposed to teach English language and so on and so forth, and that affects the strategies and procedures the teacher uses. So this one is not necessarily about the fact that the teacher is Korean, but the context in which this teacher is operating. Okay? So this one is context-based. In what ways does working in groups contribute to learners' ability? So again, this one is a really focused question where the researcher is going to go and examine the way groups work and interview members of groups to find out how maybe a group discussion has contributed to a certain topic and they maybe also interview teachers to see the difference when they give a group assignment and an individual assignment. And there the researcher, you even see how the researcher is going to collect that information. So all these examples, you can read through them. Essentially go back through these lists that we talked about. Sorry about that, I got disconnected.
Doctor, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. So just some tips to help you guide you as you develop your research questions. You can ask a few general questions, which you can see whether you answer yes or no to participants to share information with you. Ask questions that are neutral, those that explore, that have an exploratory language to it. Like what is the effect of this? What happens when this is happening? What do you feel about this? Those are neutral questions. They are there to explore. The objective about a neutral question, it is there to explore a subject. Design and write 2 question types, yeah? Central question and sub-questions, and then give them out to others just to look at it and see if the central question one can give you an answer, and if the sub-questions can help you answer the overall question. Don't worry too much about the beginning. Usually this is an area where there's a lot of thinking, a lot of debate, and you can easily give up on what you're doing because things may seem a bit too much initially. Do we have any questions so far?
For me, no.
Okay. So just to go back, remember there's a central question and the sub-questions help answer your overall question. So here I just give just some brief discussion. It's basically going back to what we had earlier. You may have a central question like, what does it mean to practitioners to be professional teachers? And then you may have a sub-question, how can language teachers be good teachers to their learners? You can practice just from these 2. Just to understand how to subdivide them. What is a good or bad question? These are just examples. You can go through these, have a discussion and see which is a good question, which is a bad question. Just some prompts you may want to have. In what ways are participants affected by X? What factors contribute to X? Just some prompts to go through these questions. I don't want us to discuss them. I want you to discuss them amongst yourselves and see which may be a good or bad question. Then afterwards, I want you to have a group assignment where you select a broad research area of your interest in respect to your fields. Identify a research area and a research problem. Formulate a research question with its sub-questions. Identify a research method to help answer your question. Indicate strategies to validate your research. Then present this on the 18th of June. Okay. Now I'm also going to do a pre-recorded lecture on quantitative research questions and hypotheses and post this. I hope I can do this by Monday, because right after this lecture, I have another lecture with undergraduate students. But do we have any questions so far?
Yes, yes, Doctor.
Yes,
Sorry
please.
for for asking so many questions.
No, it's okay.
From the research, we normally relate our context with the various or previous researchers. What could be like, how can I even phrase it? For example, we have researchers who search those concepts in 1990, 1989, 2000. Are we supposed to reference the latest research, or even these researchers that were there in 1990, 2000? What could be the right context to be referenced or to be cited?
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Which
Tom.
years? What could be the range of the, for example, if I'm to do the citation, I'm sorry, I don't know whether it is in line of this discussion. I'm sorry, but
No,
I just wanted to be guided.
I think that your question is a very good one, Tom. Thank you for asking it. It's a good one. How far back should our literature, our citation go? Now, there are certain things which are standard. For example, a definition of case study, maybe you're defining the case study strategy. That is pretty standard. I don't need to get the latest research, because that is it is by now we have an agreed definition of case study. There are certain concepts which are agreed upon now, and we don't need to go back and look for new definitions. So that one, we don't need to look for the latest. However, in regard to your research area, or the nature of your research, or the context, you must bring the most up-to-date information. Take an example. If you, Tom, are interested in customer care retention, you may want to tell us what, or if there's any research that has been done on customer retention in Uganda. You may tell us that, you may let us know about the latest which has been done in Europe, or maybe in Africa, something that has been done in one country, maybe in South Africa or something, and that thing has been published. You may let us know. You may also let us know that if there's any or no research that has been done about customer retention in Uganda. And therefore, the lack of it, then you argue that is the reason why one of the reasons why you're doing this research, because there's not been any publication on customer retention and product innovation in Uganda. Yeah, so that is a motivation. But as far as the latest research, you really need to bring that. There must have been research done in Europe, in the US, maybe in South Africa, maybe, I don't know, maybe in Nigeria, I'm not sure, but you bring that. If there is none in Uganda, you actually point out that because my research is contextual, looking at the Ugandan context, scanning through the literature, there is none. There is no publication, there's no research that has been done in Uganda. There may have been research, but if it hasn't been published, then it cannot be considered research. Yes, Robert, you have a question. Tom, I hope I've answered your question.
Very well, very well. Thank you so much, Doctor.
You're welcome. Yes, Robert.
May I have a question?
Yes, please.
On the assignment, actually, don't leave.
Yes, please.
For some of us who have already started working on our research,
yes,
yeah, because we kind of picked broad topics that require a lot of research and take a lot of time.
Mhm,
So for this assignment in the group,
mhm.
is it okay if we still use our final research paper? If, for example, my group agrees and we do mine, or one of my colleagues wants us to do his research topic, or should we just choose a different topic altogether for this?
It's okay. If the group wishes to use that topic, it's okay. There is no problem.
Thank you.
Robert, you had a question.
Yes, I had a question. Mine was, I don't know if I got Tom, but I don't know if it's Tom who was asking you about how far you could go in citation. When I last did research, my supervisor told me that we're supposed to get citations that are not a decade ago. For
Mhm.
example, we're in 2021.
Yes.
So anything below 2011 is not supposed to be cited. I don't know if this one applies here, because some research topics have less citations, and the citations that could be relevant or could have more information that could be used or applied were cited like a decade below. Or, for example, now we're in 2021 and then you get information that is maybe was cited in 2000s and everything, and then it has relevant information that you would love to cite. I don't know if you quoted that kind of information, or if you cited it, it could be relevant to our research. I'm just asking, I just want to know.
Now, in terms of identifying the gap, specifically the gap, it is best that you use the latest. Because if you use, let's say, if you cited research that was done in 2010, yeah, in 2010 or 2008, and you're saying in 2008 a research was done and said this didn't happen. What, in all that time, nobody else did any research? That would be the question. As far as that topic is concerned, is that possible? That from 2008 to now, there was no research done? That would be the major question.
You are right, but yes, Kripen.
There's what we call time scope. We have the geographical scope, content scope, and time scope. Now, in the time scope, it's always advisable that you state the range of your literature. And from what I've seen, it's always good that you state, like, for example, your literature will be in between 10 years. For example, if we are in 2021, you can say my time scope will be from 2020 to backwards 10 years, which will be like 2010, so that you give yourself a gap. You reach a situation and you cannot really pick the latest information. Latest meaning they are like 1 or 2 years back, because you find some of that work is not yet published. So what I normally do, I give in the time scope, I state that my time scope will be from this time to this time. Now, once you state the time scope, you state the reason why you have done it. For example, if I say my time scope will be from 2012, from 2010 up to 2020, then you give a reason. Probably this was the time when ICT governance or ICT alignment or ICT adoption was gaining momentum in most organizations.
Thank you, Kripen. Thank you. Thank you, Kripen, for that clarification. Now, yes, please, Robert.
Before you give your submission, I think Kripen has given a very clear explanation on what I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
But my question, okay, I have a little question to submit on that. What if I have good citations from researchers and their research is about 20 years ago.
Mm.
So, like I had told you before, I worked with some researchers, but they were agriculturists, and most of the doctors were like, if the research that you're trying to cite is a decade below, then it will not bring out more relevant information, because information evolves and evolves. So now if I happen to choose a research topic and it has citations that I would love to use and they are like 20 or 21 years ago, is it allowed for me, like Crippen said, to indicate it in the time scope that I'm going to use years from maybe 20? I'm going to get my information from maybe 2000, okay, let's say 2000 to 2021. Is that allowed?
As long as you have valid reasons for it, as long as you know that the reason why I'm doing this is that maybe this information best explains or helps me best contrast my findings for now. Yes, Susan.
Okay.
Yes, please. So during my research, there are some issues that I discovered. Apologies. I think I have noise in the background. Okay, this is better. I was saying, during my research, I discovered some issues on the problem statement I was working on, which is meant for my research. And some of them were quite major issues that required immediate attention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I had to share some of the information of my research with the respective people on ground and my colleagues, so we could help for that moment, because it is a health issue. And so in my research, when I am submitting my paper, have I already sold out my research? Do I have to
no number one, as long as you have not published, something is not published, then it's not research. It's only after you publish that's when it's considered. So no, if there are certain things, if they're urgent, then that's an action that is being taken. And for you now as a researcher, you also take opportunity to learn from that action, an action that has been taken. You take that as an opportunity. One of the key points that is key, you should note, Susan, if something is already being done, start recording now in a diary. Yeah, so
I am recording and the implementation team as well.
Yes. So start recording, and you're going to use that later on as part of your raw data that you analyze.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So do we have any other question? Do you have any other question? So I thank you for listening. I beg to quickly leave you because I have another group I'm meeting at 11. So I'm requesting if I can end this one now, and let us meet on next Friday. And I'll also have a pre-recorded lecture up for you, hopefully by Monday.
All right, thank you.
Okay, have a good weekend, everyone.
Okay.